So I have to say, in many ways, this was a hard sermon for me to prepare. I always find the beginning of the sermon the hardest part. That's the part where I've read the lessons at the beginning of the week, and then I spend the week, really kind of living them out and thinking about them and trying to kind of cull my life or the life of other people and find what I think is a really good current life application of the scripture and start with that. That's the hardest part for me. Once I get into the part where I'm kind of picking apart the actual text, I find that far easier. But what's the important part to me is hoping that you find this connection. And so I work really hard at doing those. I can't say that they always fit, but that's just me. That's what I'm always trying to do. So the difficulty for today is that I had too many stories to tell. I had too many stories about how of things that I've heard and seen that fit our passage in Corinthians. Lest you worry, I was going to go with the gospel. Let's just clear the air right now, okay? I'm not going to touch this murder, adultery, stuff like that today. So I had written 3 different beginnings to a sermon, and they were all, I was really into this story, into the stories and how they really related, and it just got to where I was like, I have enough trouble keeping my sermons to a reasonable amount of time, and so I just started over again. So we've got this congregation in Corinth that is about 5 years old, and Paul is the apostle that began the congregation and built it up and first proclaimed the message of Christ crucified and risen and gathered people together to meet in homes and to worship. But then he went on because that was his task, is to plant congregations, and Apollos came and took over the congregation following him. So the whole letter of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, are letters that Paul's writing to the congregation, because even after only 5 years, they are having a whole lot of divisions within their congregations, and so they've written to Paul about them. In this passage, we're hearing the divisions about the people who claim allegiance either to Paul or to Apollos, and so he wants to address that. Because the people think that depending on who they align themselves with, it will give them some kind of a power or leadership in the congregation. So Paul wants to kind of nip that in the bud. So Paul has written, we've seen in some of his letters where he's done these self-deprecating things, I don't speak so well, and all of these sorts of things, and so we've learned that he doesn't seem to have this powerful speaking style. He can be rather crotchety in his interactions with people, but he is the founder of this community, and people tend to have a lot of loyalty, and it's not like they have a huge amount of time between Paul and where they are now. And then we hear from Luke, who wrote the book of Acts as the second part of his gospel. In there, he describes Apollos as a Jewish Christian who was an eloquent man, well-versed in the scripture, who spoke with a burning enthusiasm about Jesus. So if you're looking at pastoral leadership styles, you've got this young, well-spoken, eloquent man, Apollos, and you've got this guy who used to murder Christians, who is older and burns with the zeal that often comes out as, frankly, a little bit bullying, and he's not very eloquent. And so people are saying that pastoral leadership style is terrible, and you should, we need to just move on. Or the ones that say, no, we need to stick with the one that really began and fed and nurtured us. Of the congregations that I work with, or that I know about, 95% of the congregations that I know of that are in conflict cite pastoral leadership style. as the reason that they are in conflict. 95% say that that's the primary reason that they are in conflict. And while I recognize that not every pastor is right for every congregation, I certainly understand that, I also know that relationships are two-way streets, and I also recognize that what we claim to be the problem is very rarely the real reason for the conflict, that there are underlying things that go into that. I find that the real conflict, or what's really going on in congregations, generally is fear and uncertainty and powerlessness. Those, I think, are the three primary causes for all conflict, or for most of it. The fear is, as we see declining members, declining attendance, we see declining financial resources, and then the uncertainty of what that means, and the fear that most congregations have that they choose or don't want to verbally or mentally, intellectually acknowledge is their fear of survival, the fear that they're going to close within your own lifetime. We don't want to be seen as the people that ruined the church or that made it fail or something like this. I heard that so often at Gloria Day as we were closing, that they were lamenting that we're going to be the ones that are seen as the ones who failed. And they weren't. They were not. They were good and faithful servants. And it was so many things that it takes more than one group of people to make a congregation close. So that is, I never see it that simply. I also know that there's often a sense of powerlessness with that uncertainty, that as congregations try different things to reverse the trend or whatever, then sometimes power shifts, and somebody that has been responsible or whose voice carried a lot of weight is suddenly not given that same sort of authority that they had had. And so then I tend to think that much of this is subconscious. I don't think any of us really sit down and plan to get angry and to lash out at people. But that it happens. So I think then, so the cause then of that what happens is that we have all these internal responses and reactions to our fear, which is fear, uncertainty, powerlessness. It's hard to deal with those things inside, in any place in our lives. And what happens is that our brain is geared for survival. We want to survive. And so the way to survive is to find a reason or a cause for these feelings. And our brain wants it to be external, because we can tackle that. It's hard to change how we feel inside, but it's easy for me to attack Stan as the reason why things happen here at Lutheran Church. The master, Stan. And generally the person that becomes attacked is the pastor, and the pastor then becomes a polarizing figure, with congregations camped and those who are for the pastor and those against the pastor. And they see that the pastor's leadership style is the reason why numbers are declining, etc. It's a vicious circle. Paul begins with this question: what is your name? No, sorry. What is Apollos? What is Paul? Do you notice he's not asking who? He's not looking at the personality. He's not asking you to look at the style or the person. He's asking you to look at their function. And what he does with that is, instead of aligning or villainizing Apollos or separating himself, he brings he and Apollos together in the eyes of the Corinthians. What is Apollos? What is Paul? We are workers. We are servants of God in your midst. We share a function together. And what this means to our lives is that we are doing the same thing for you. We may have different ways of doing them, but we are working for God with you and among you. And then he uses these these everyday images to talk about what that might look like. And so, using this illustration of a garden, Paul says, Apollos and I are garden tools. I'm that seed scatterer that's throwing seeds out onto the ground, and Apollos, he's the watering can that we use to water the seeds. And when people come into a garden, what is it that they're looking at? They look at the flowers or the vegetables or whatever it is that has grown, and they marvel at the beauty of what they see. They don't go to the gardens and go, oh my gosh, is this the coolest seed thing I've ever seen? Oh, look at this watering can. If it weren't for this watering can, this garden would be nothing. Or what about that hoe? Oh my God, okay, and I mean that by the thing. And look at this rake. Look at all these tools. Wow, thank goodness for those tools. These tools are beautiful. These tools are gorgeous. I could kind of look at these tools all the time. No. People come to look at the garden. And what makes the garden grow? But God. The growth is all God's doing. The soil, the seeds, the sun, the rain, the people that God calls, the instruments that God provides to work in the garden. It is God's work and activity. That's what is behind the garden. We see the fruits of God's work. We see the growth. We see the beauty. We see the variety. And so Paul is telling to the Corinthians that the only right way to interpret what is happening in your midst is not what I did or what Apollos is doing, but to look at the work of God in your midst, to emphasize that we're all one and the same. There are no celebrities in this work. The main actor is God, and we are simply servants of God. To me, the root of all conflict is sin. I wish I could eradicate sin. I wish I could take people's fears out of them. I wish I could take my own fears out of me. I wish I could alleviate pain and suffering and all those things. And I can't. Sin is always going to happen. It's just who we are. And I don't know if you've ever taken the Crossways Bible study, but the image, the illustration for sin is an inward arrow. Because it says sin is us always turning in on ourselves. That we're looking inward, we're looking at ourselves and saying, I have to be in control. I need to be the one doing this. I can do this. Or looking at our fears or whatever, but we are looking inward. And I think it's an incredible symbol of what sin is. It hits the heart of where I see most pastors and congregations erring the same way that the Corinthians do. Because we think of congregations, and we think of that which we've given our time, our money, our attention. We love our church. This is my church. I have been here. It is mine. I hear pastors talking about my church, and I hear members talking about my church. And when I catch myself talking to other pastors and saying, oh yeah, my church, where we alternate, I catch myself and I say, the congregation I am currently serving. And it's not just because I'm an interim. I would say that as a permanent pastor. Because I am simply serving in God's congregation. I'm serving with the people that God has called together. It's God's ministry, it's God's church, it's God's work that has called you all together. We are the garden tools that till the soil, that plant the seeds, that water. We are workers, and we work long and hard, and sometimes we have calluses on our hands and we're exhausted, and we look at all the work we've done and we don't see anything happening, and we wonder if anything is going to work, and we worry and we're uncertain. because we think we need to do more or something, and it's God's work. And our responsibility is to live as God has called us to live. And if that means that nothing grows, then maybe that's what God is intending. I think God is a God of reconciliation and growth. And I think it takes turning out from ourselves and upward to heaven, to listening, to discerning where it is that we're being called, that we become the faithful workers. I give that talk to congregations in transition when I'm going as their consultant, as opposed to just being their pastor. So it's sometimes weird for me to tell you, because I'm with y'all more than I'm working with you in more in depth than I do with the congregations that I'll go to on Saturdays and visit. I really do want you to understand that I see you as co-workers with me and with God. That we are the people that God has called to serve. And I think that we need to experience in that an optimism and a hope. And here's just where I want to leave you. I see Lutheran Church of the Master as a far more hopeful place than most congregations I go. I see y'all already unbent. I see such hope for you and for your abilities to do the work that God's calling you to do. I see so much hope that God has great plans for you, because I see you already being responsive and growing yourselves and wanting to help others grow. So I leave you with this. I want to encourage you to continue your work and to continue the ways that you've seen God's calling to serve God and serve others. And that together, as we continue to discern what that means, that we will in fact be able to stand back and to see the sprouts that God brings forth in your midst.